String cutter!
Freeze!
Think you can get away?
Freeze!
Let's play! Touch it! Oh,
Yeah, brace yourself. This is gonna hurt.
What's up guys, Enigma Av here, and I'm going to be doing a guide and showcase on a perma-freeze Childe Ganyu build. What I love about this build is that the monsters basically stay frozen and they just wait patiently to, well, die. It can trivialize a lot of mechanics such as shields because you could freeze the monsters and keep them frozen before the shields even come out while you just burst them down with either Childe or Ganyu. And this does work a lot better with more targets, but it's definitely viable against single targets. So without further ado, let's get into it. For this specific setup, we'll be using Childe as the main DPS, Xingqiu as the support DPS, Ganyu as the cryo application and freeze enabler, and then Venti as crowd control. So for Childe here, I'm actually going to be running him with a Skyward Harp. It's probably the best in slot weapon for him, honestly. Another option is maybe Rust. I don't actually have Rust, but Rust is definitely probably the second best option here. Or if you have a really high refinement Rust, it may actually do better than Skyward Harp. As for the artifacts, I am running 4-piece Heart of the Depths. That's probably the best set for Childe. It's kind of geared towards him. If you want to focus more on his burst, then you probably want to go with 2-piece Hydro and then maybe 2-piece Noblesse. And now for the artifacts, I have the feather here. I meant flower. The feather here. The hourglass. Hydro damage bonus, goblet. That's really important to have hydro damage here. And then I have a crit rate hat. Now just depending on your substats, you can go crit rate or crit damage. Just you want to keep a 1-to-2 ratio right here. So that means having whatever you have for your crit damage, you want about half of that in crit rate. The closer to that you have, the more damage that you will actually output. The hydro damage is really important for this specific setup, and I'll explain why in just a minute. And as for the constellation, I actually have a C1 Childe. This does actually play not quite a significant role, but you're going to have to be much more. It allows you to be much more lenient with your timing when you do switch off of characters, because your elemental skill would come up a lot more often. So just play a little more carefully if you don't actually have him at C1, but this is perfectly playable at C0. As for the Xingqiu, he's actually the supporting DPS. Now, one requirement of this is actually to have at least a sacrificial sword, in my opinion. You really need a sacrificial sword to use Xingqiu. There are other options to replace Xingqiu, as like you could maybe use Diona. You could, yeah, I'd say probably Diona. That way you'd even get resonance with this specific team. Xingqiu, what makes Xingqiu really work well here is probably having him at C2, because what he does is he decreases the hydro resistance every time that a rain sword does hit the opponent when he's using his burst, and he also gets an extra 3 seconds, which helps you cycle your burst a lot faster. Now, another thing that is really important here actually is to have a decent amount of elemental recharge so we can self-fund his ult. With sacrificial sword, you can this normally does proc 90% of the time when I'm using him. It does proc, so he can normally self-fund his ult, and even, you know, his ult will be half full by the time I even switch off of him. As for the artifacts, we are going to be running Noblesse on him for the 20% attack buff for the entire party for 12 seconds. Here's our flower here. Here's the plume. We're doing an attack pocket watch here. Well, an attack sands here. And then we have the goblet here. Hydro damage is also really important to have here. And then I have a crit rate hat as well. Again, we're trying to keep that 2-to-1 ratio going here, and I'm pretty close here actually. But you definitely want to have at least 170% elemental recharge. The more the better, but you can aim for that on your substats. Now for Ganyu, we actually are running her as support more so here for the weapon. I'm using Favonius Warbow. Now, the good thing about Favonius Warbow is with this, you can basically always have her burst ready. You can run with more of a DPS option, but you do want to make sure that she has a bit of elemental recharge if possible. I'd say at least 150%, but I have a little more here, just so she can fund her own ultimate. Another option is you can actually swirl with the Viridescent here to actually help fund her ult. So we're actually going to be running 4-piece Blizzard Strayer here. This is probably the best set for her for this specific setup because the enemies are basically always going to be frozen. So you're always going to get this 40% crit rate boost. Now here's our flower here, our feather and plume here. Here's our sands. I really do suggest attack percent, but if you are struggling with energy recharge, it's perfectly fine to go energy recharge here instead. And then here's our goblet. Cryo bonus is probably the best in slot here for her as well. And as for the hat, I am using crit rate. If you can get your crit rate to around, ideally you do want 60% here, that way she'll have 100% crit rate, but this is perfectly fine at 40%, which basically means she has 86% crit rate in this case. Crit damage is really actually helpful here as well. Now for Venti, we're actually going to be running him with an Amos bow. This Amos bow really scales well with Venti just because he scales really good off of attack. Another option is actually stringless. If you that's really good with Venti because it boosts his elemental skill and his burst. You can actually also run him with Favonius if you like. This will actually help fund your whole party with the proc of Windfall here. The artifacts I'm running is Viridescence, of course, for the swirl effect, which reduces the resistance of the element that gets infused, which is actually really helpful with this specific setup, especially if you have your Jingcho at Constellation 2. Now, here are the actual artifacts we're running on him. Here's the flower, the plume, the feather, the sands. I'm good with attack percent here. You can run elemental recharge if you're having trouble funding his ult, but you can normally keep his ult up with fairly little investment into energy recharge. And here's the Anemo damage goblet, which is definitely best in slot for him here. And then I have a crit rate hat as well. Now here's everyone's stats. Here's Childe. Here is Jingcho. And then we have Ganyu here. And Venti. Again, really the only requirement is to have a sacrificial sword on your Jingcho. Otherwise, you can actually use Ganyu, a Diona instead. Or you could even use Kaya if you really wanted to. Diona and Kaya are actually going to give you also the cryo bonus, which gives you more of a crit rate. But with this set, we're really just utilizing the shred from the hydro resist to really boost Childe's damage, and grouping from Venti so that Childe's Riptide will actually, his effect will proc and hit everything. And when you group with Ganyu's ult, it actually does us a substantial amount of damage, you know, a lot more. Another option if you don't actually have Venti is Sucrose. Now, if you do run Sucrose, you definitely need Elemental Recharge. I haven't fully built my Sucrose up yet, but you probably want to have a Elemental Recharge Sands here, and you definitely need at least a C1 so you can have more charges with your E skill. And I don't have a lot of Elemental Recharge here, but you know, having a little more will definitely be better. If you don't have the Sacrificial Fragments, which is also just great for her, you could also run it with a Favonius Codex, and that normally does work really well, so she can actually fund her own ultimate. So here's how the setup actually works. You start with Xing Cho and apply Hydro and activate his burst. If you have him at C2, using his burst first will actually allow his burst to be active alongside everyone else's burst, and this also allows his cooldown to be ready at around the same time. Without his C2, it still works fine. You just have to be more mindful of your timing. Next, it's time to suck with Venti. The Viridescent set will shred the resistance of the Hydro in this situation if you can get Childe out quick enough, as well as the Cryo, and that will give a huge boost in damage overall. Next is Ganyu's turn. You want to start off using her skill immediately followed by her burst. Next, when you go in with Childe, it's important that you actually auto-attack a few times first if you do have C2 on your Xing Cho, because that's going to further shred the Hydro resistance, and then use your burst directly after to get the strongest hit. Next, you can cycle back to Xing Cho, rinse with Childe, repeat with Venti until the monsters disappear.
Shouldn't let your guard down.
This is definitely my favorite freeze comp just because I like Childe more as a main DPS than Ganyu. Ganyu might be able to dish out a little more damage, but her freeze application isn't the best. And with this, normally the enemies literally cannot move because they're just constantly frozen. I do have a C1 Childe, as I said, but it should still work with C0. You just have to be a lot more cautious with your timing and when you do want to, you know, cycle out of Childe. But it still is perfectly viable at C0.
Know my soul. The more, the merrier. How do you know? Over here. Let me weave you a verse. Here we go. Time for takeoff. For Rex Lapis.
Brace yourself. This is gonna hurt.
Know my soul. Rain cutter. Lord of icy frost. All hail! Yeah, time for takeoff.
I hope you all enjoyed this showcase of one of my favorite ways to play Childe and Ganyu. Please subscribe, like, and leave a comment, as well as any questions about this video. Until next time, Enigma, out.
Shouldn't let your guard down.